Somewhere in the woods in Prince George's County, Maryland, right next to a manicured veterans cemetery, are the bodies of children. No headstones, no names, no funerals, just cinder blocks disappearing under a century of leaves and overgrowth. These were not adults. They were children, some as young as 5 years old, who died inside a Maryland juvenile detention facility, and the facility is still open today. This is not ancient history. This is a cover-up, and it connects directly to the juvenile justice system operating in this country right now. What is up, everyone? Welcome back to JJ Decoded, where we break down the juvenile justice system so it actually makes sense. Today's video is different. I need you to sit with what I'm about to tell you, because this story has been buried for 150 years, and it deserves your full attention. We are talking about the House of Reformation and Instruction for Colored Children, a juvenile detention facility in Cheltenham, Maryland, where approximately 300 black boys died in custody, were buried in unmarked graves in the woods, and were forgotten by the government that put them there. Let us get into it. In 1873, 8 years after the Civil War ended, the state of Maryland opened the House of Reformation and Instruction for Colored Children in Cheltenham, Maryland. It was the first juvenile detention center for black boys below the Mason-Dixon Line. 8 years after slavery was abolished, the state of Maryland built a facility specifically to incarcerate black children, and it operated for nearly 70 years. Boys were sent here for what today we would consider minor offenses: truancy, petty theft, being deemed incorrigible. Some came from Baltimore City, some from rural Maryland. Some were as young as 5 years old. 5 years old in a juvenile detention facility in 1873. Right down the road sat the equivalent facility for white boys, the House of Refuge. Same state, same era, two completely different realities. Capitol News Service analyzed 142 death certificates from this facility. What they found was a catalog of neglect so severe that a grand jury, using the language of that era, wrote that conditions were, quote, not fit for a dog. Let me tell you what killed these children. About 100 boys died of tuberculosis. More than a dozen died of pneumonia. Boys died of typhoid fever, meningitis, venereal diseases documented in a 1935 grand jury report. And then there's this. A 10-year-old boy died of exhaustion, not disease, not an accident, exhaustion from the labor they forced him to do. In 1934, the Child Welfare League of America conducted an investigation and found that boys were living in overcrowded dormitories, with boys actively sick and dying from tuberculosis, receiving no proper medical care. Boys were ruled almost entirely by fear, according to investigators who visited the facility. They reported that the children would not even speak to them. That is how afraid they were. 300 boys dead in a facility run by the state of Maryland. For children. Now here is where this story becomes something that will make your stomach turn. Boys at Cheltenham attended school for half a day. The other half? Hard manual labor. They worked 6 days a week for contractors around Maryland, on farms and factories, to help pay the costs of running the facility that was imprisoning them. In a dim basement, black boys sorted straw and operated the foot treadles of broom binding machines, trapped in a room filled with dust and flying chaff that damaged their lungs with every breath. The grand jury's own words described this as a, quote, system of virtual peonage. Their words, not mine. This practice dated to at least 1875 and continued for nearly 60 years. But it gets worse. The facility had a parole system. When boys were released, they were not free. They were paroled directly into labor for white families, as domestic workers, as farmhands, bound to that work until they turned 21. Some worked past their release date. This was not rehabilitation. This was not reform. This was slavery. State-sanctioned, government-administered, applied to children 8 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Remember that white facility right down the road? Here's the comparison. Same era, same state, same approximate population. 243 deaths at the black facility, 26 deaths at the white facility. Black boys at Cheltenham were 9 times more likely to die than white boys at the facility down the road. Different schooling, different medical care, no forced labor contracts at the white facility. Different outcomes, same state government running both. This was not neglect. Neglect is accidental. This was policy. The facility stopped its most egregious practices in the 1940s. The grounds were repurposed, and the graves, those unmarked, forgotten graves in the woods, were left exactly where they were. Here is the detail that will stay with you. Right next to those unmarked children's graves is the Cheltenham State Veterans Cemetery, perfectly maintained, green lawns, proper headstones, honored dead. And right next door, separated by tree line, 4 barely visible tombstones, rows of cinder blocks disappearing under a century of debris and leaves. The veterans got a cemetery. The children got the woods. For over 80 years, investigators documented what happened here. Grand jury reports, child welfare investigations, all of them describing abuse, death, and peonage. Nothing changed. Nobody was held accountable, and the graves stayed hidden in the woods. It took the Washington Post rediscovering those graves in July 2025, 150 years after the facility opened, to force the state of Maryland to respond. On May 7, 2026, just 3 weeks ago, Maryland Governor Wes Moore stood at the site of this facility and unveiled a historical marker. The inscription on that marker reads, "This is where they came to die." That is what the state of Maryland put on the official marker. Not to soften it, not to sanitize it, because there is no softer way to say it. Maryland lawmakers passed Senate Bill 776 and House Bill 552 this session, creating an official commission on the House of Reformation to investigate the facility, locate every grave, and determine how to honor the boys buried there. Governor Moore committed $1 million over 4 years to the project. The Maryland Department of Juvenile Services was awarded a $200,000 grant for a ground-penetrating radar survey of the woods. Right now, today, investigators are scanning the ground to find out exactly how many children are buried there. The legislation also calls for DNA collection to identify potential descendants of boys who died here, so that families may one day know what happened to their ancestors. An estimated 230 graves, according to the Maryland Historical Trust. An estimated 300 total deaths, according to state records. The full count is not yet known, because for 150 years, nobody looked. Here is the fact that should close the loop on everything we just covered. The facility in Cheltenham, Maryland, built in 1873 to incarcerate Black children, is still operating as a youth detention center today. The same ground, the same address. The children in there right now are overwhelmingly Black. Black youth make up 15% of the United States youth population, but 46% of all incarcerated youth in this country are Black. Nothing about this is coincidence. The racial disparities in today's juvenile justice system did not appear out of nowhere. They were built systematically, deliberately, by more than 150 years by institutions exactly like the one we just described. The names on the buildings changed, the racial composition of who gets locked up did not. You cannot understand the juvenile justice system today without understanding how it was built. 300 Black boys, some as young as 5, dead from tuberculosis, pneumonia, exhaustion, and neglect, buried in unmarked graves in the woods, forced to work for contractors and white families while they were supposed to be in school, and forgotten for 150 years. That is not history. That is a foundation. The state of Maryland is just now beginning to look for their graves, just now giving them a marker, just now saying their names matter. That is 150 years too late. If you want to understand the juvenile justice system, start here. If this video moved you, share it. These boys deserve to be known. Drop their story in the comments. Tell someone who does not know. Subscribe to JJ Decoded, and I will see you on the next one.